Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Good to see you guys. If you are new here with us, my name is John Wagler, and I'm part of the team here, and just truly is an honor to have you here. As Venus shared earlier, we put a lot of time and effort into culture and environment here, and what I mean by that is, we want you to know God, all right? Or know Jesus. That's kind of like our main thing here, and that as you begin to know Jesus and explore what that means, that you stay curious and you keep asking questions and keep learning new things and growing, and then from that point we live it out and live like we mean it. And so that's what we talk about all the time here, and just so grateful that you're here to be a part of this, and thankful that you chose to be here, because it's a big deal, because you could be a lot of other places on a Sunday morning. So thanks so much. We are in this series called You Have Heard, and if you're just hopping in with us here this morning, this is week number 5 of a 14-week series on the Sermon on the Mount. And so if you're not familiar with the Bible, the Sermon on the Mount is actually a large collection of the teachings of Jesus, and we actually find it. This guy named Matthew wrote this letter to kind of detail out some of the teachings of Jesus, and as he did that, he put them together in Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7, and what we begin to see here is that Jesus starts talking to these followers, or to these listeners, really, and he wants them to understand something a little bit deeper, and he says, hey, you've heard it one way, but I'm telling you it's different than that. And he's pretty serious and sometimes very blunt throughout all of these teachings, and we've discovered that a little bit every single week. And it's important for us to take it in, because here's who Jesus was talking to. He was talking to people that were religious leaders. He was talking to people who were wealthy, some that were poor, some that knew nothing about God, some that knew a lot. And so Jesus is speaking to a very wide spectrum of folks, and he's kind of getting them to what really matters. When I think about this You Have Heard as the title of the sermon series, each week, I just, as I've been reflecting on it, I started wondering to myself, I wonder if we should have named it you should really hear this. Because that's what I feel like Jesus is saying, you need to hear this. For some of us, maybe after the first few weeks, you might have termed it let's all be miserable together, which is a fair assessment too, of we feel man, Jesus comes down so hard on all of this stuff, and he starts off, and this is what we talked about in week 1, but he starts off by talking about, hey, this is what it means to be blessed. This isn't a checklist or a to-do list. This isn't if I do this, then I get this, right? I was reading an interview of Justin Bieber the other day, and I know why, I don't know, but but he said this, when he felt because he was pure, God gave him a wife. Essentially what he said. And I'm man, that's just not how this works. Okay, and that's kind of really bad theology, even though he's got some good stuff about him. But I'm I just wish that wasn't the case. But that's how we think a lot of times. If I do this, then I'll get this. But what Jesus is actually teaching in the blessed part is this idea that we need this heart. And then when we have this kind of heart and this posture and this position, that's when God's with us. And then we get to experience him in all these different seasons of life. And when we're feeling down, when we're feeling lowly, when we're feeling so humiliated, in these moments, and then into the heights of those moments too, and he's I'm with you. The idea of blessed we think is happy, but what Jesus was actually teaching, it's God's on your side in the midst of this. And so it's important to think that. And he kind of moves on from there, and he talks about what does it mean to live it out and be salt and light in the earth, and he says some other stuff too. And then he kind of has this little pivot point, and this was week 3 for us, but this little pivot point, he starts getting very practical. And so he taps into anger first, and he kind of brings in murder and anger in the same thing. And then last week we talked about lust, and he kind of brings in lust with adultery, and it's an interesting kind of thing. He's trying to make it a little more serious. You've heard it this way, but I'm telling you it's this way. And so that's what Jesus begins to do. And so this week we're tackling another topic that Jesus is very blunt about. And I want to, whenever we handle sensitive topics, which we do here all the time. If you've been around here for any length of time, I don't shy away from anything, and we talk about a lot of different things culturally and stuff. But, this topic in particular, I actually think is probably, I was telling Lacey, this is probably the hardest sermon I've ever had to put together because of how sensitive this topic is, which is, because Jesus is also very blunt in it. And the topic we're going to be talking about today is divorce. And it's something that you probably haven't heard a sermon on. be my guess, or if you did, in the context of church, most people felt like pretty judged or condemned in the midst of it. And I just want to say this up front, that just stick with me like throughout the whole sermon. Here's why. I might say something that you might latch onto right away, and then you're going to miss kind of how it comes back around. Okay, because what we're going to see, and this is what's just difficult about this teaching, is we're going to see that Jesus is very blunt. And how he talks is like just, it's so matter of fact. And we're going to look at two different passages this morning. But I also know that there's a theological component to this, but there's also a very practical one. Just by a show of hands, I'm not going to ask who's been divorced, but show of hands, like, how many of us in this room have been impacted in some way by divorce in your life? Okay, which is most of the hands in this room. Okay, so it has an impact. So I understand the sensitivity of it and the practical nature of it. And so, but just stick with me throughout the whole thing. And so when we get into this whole Jesus thing, the premise and the line that we've been using every single week, and this will be the line for all 14 weeks, and what I want us to concentrate on is that Jesus is inviting the listener to follow, not to just listen. All right. So when someone's around him, he's like, I want you to follow, not just listen. It's easy to listen. It's easy to just take something in and you kind of consume it and you're like, that was nice, and move on. But what Jesus does, he says, this is about following, because following requires action. And what's actually really interesting about Jesus, and even his first disciples, they followed him before they actually believed in him. And so even when Jesus is inviting people to, so if you're here and you're like, man, I don't know about this Jesus thing, I don't know about anything about the Bible, Jesus is still, he's like, hey, just follow me and trust me. And here's what will happen. As you begin to follow me, you'll see that this is the best way to live. As you begin to follow me, you'll see that this is the most freeing way to live. As you begin to follow me, this will be the healthiest way to live. And as you do that, then you're going to start trusting in me. And as you start trusting in me, then you fully believe in me. And sometimes that's the route that people need to take. Some of you guys in here, that's not your story. Your story has been like, man, I came into church one day and they sang this one song and I was just like, here I am, right? Like, and you just believe and you're good. Like, that's other people's stories. But for some, he's just like, hey, just follow me on this. I got you. And this is another area that Jesus is teaching in. And here's just what I feel like he's kind of continuing to push into in each subject matter that he begins to work in as he gets very practical. And I think he's talking about loopholes a lot. I wrote this down, that when we are looking for a loophole, we ignore responsibility and embrace a lack of excellence. And when we're looking for a loophole, that we ignore responsibility and we embrace a lack of excellence. And so think about it this way. When you look for loopholes in your physical health, we end up avoiding responsibility of what we need to do to stay healthy. And then our bodies break down, so then we lack excellence with our bodies. And so we look for a loophole, right? And a lot of times I'm like, yeah, but if I could just take this pill. We want the easy way, but we miss out on the responsibility. Think about what you do maybe emotionally. Instead of maybe getting a counselor or having someone to talk to or a mentor or something, what do we look for a loophole, and what do? We'll avoid people or not talk about it or stuff it or act like it doesn't matter. We could do it spiritually. You know, we avoid coming to church, or we avoid community, or we avoid whatever it is. Like we avoid, and we look for loopholes. I'm good. I said yes to Jesus that one time, so I'm good. I don't need anything more. Let me see the loophole. And so we do that relationally. We do it with our friends. We could do it if we're dating someone. We look for loopholes all the time, and when that happens, when we accept those loopholes, that we then lack responsibility, and then we avoid excellence. We become people who make excuses all the time, and as you guys know, excuses are for losers. So there's a thing there all the time that as we begin to look for loopholes in our life. And so Jesus is coming back into that, even when he's talking about divorce. And so let me give you a little bit of background about divorce contextually, so when we hop right in, you're not just like, what just happened, okay? Contextually, back then, divorce, there were two major schools of thought, and there were these rabbinic schools. One was Hillel and one was Shammai, and the Hillel school was pretty, it was essentially you could divorce for any reason you wanted to. It didn't matter. All you needed to do was present a certificate. The man would present a certificate, and you were good to go. And it just didn't matter. If the wife didn't cook a meal the way that the husband wanted it, he would have been like, you know what, I'm out. and you're divorced. You're done. And it was mostly on the man all the time. Like he was presenting the certificate. It was a communal thing. Like the whole entire community would know about the divorce. Even divorce was like, you had legal binding aspects to divorce. It wasn't just for married couples. Even if you were engaged, you still had to get divorced if you wanted to break it off. So if you think Mary and Joseph in the Christmas story, the reason why he talks about going to divorce Mary was not because they were married, it was because, so get this, if say two 13-year-olds made a promise to want to marry each other, all right? And so some of you guys remember this when you were 13, right? You practiced what your name looked like, like all those things, right, with all the hearts and the swirls. And what happened is, you can make that promise, and if your families agreed to it, it was a legally binding thing. So at 17, if all you're like, man, puberty did not work out the way I thought it was going to, kind of deal, or whatever, you're just like, no, I don't want this anymore, something else happened, then you had to go through this legal process to get divorced. So there's this kind of no-fault idea in the hell. And the other school of thought was like, well, no, the only way you can get divorced was through something with sexual immorality. All right, so that was just that. So these two schools of thoughts that were within that. Then also, even contextually within that, there were some accepted things that were options for divorce, and you can tie them into some things that were written in Deuteronomy and Exodus in our Bibles. But if you neglected the spouse, so if a man neglected his wife, didn't provide with food, with shelter, with marital rights, that was an option to be able to get divorced. If there was abuse and abandonment, it was another thing that could cause divorce, and that was a justifiable thing there. And so those are all kind of woven into the kind of community of thought that would have already been presented. So when we see what Jesus actually says here and how he responds to the question about divorce, he doesn't go through all of those things because they already knew it. It was accepted culturally, and so he's speaking to something very differently. And so he didn't have to get into all the details. They would have already known that. And so Jesus then starts talking as he gets asked about divorce. So we're going to start off in Matthew chapter 5, and then we're going to bounce to Matthew chapter 19 because we need the full kind of context of how Jesus taught about marriage. And we also have to know this about marriage, that it's not talked a lot about in the Bible. And there's some reasons for that. I think partially because there was some accepted already thought process that didn't need to be taught on. But then some of it was marriage wasn't elevated to the same way we do it now in our culture. And so being single was okay back then too. And so it's a little different even contextually there with the Bible. So we'll be in Matthew chapter 5, starting verse 31. It says this. Jesus says, "You have heard," right? That's our line. "You have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery." So Jesus says this. Again, it's just a quick little phrase. And he says, no, you've heard it this way, that you can just kind of do what you want. You can divorce just by giving her a certificate and just saying you're done. But I'm saying it's bigger than that. I'm saying it's way more serious than that. And then if you go that route of just kind of the no-fault idea and just do whatever you want, here's what you're doing. You're causing that woman, because that woman would have then, in order to have marital rights and kind of been person accepted into society, that woman would have had to then go find someone else to marry her. And so Jesus says, if she does that, then she's committing adultery. You're forcing her to do so. And then you're forcing the guy who marries her to commit adultery. And then he kind of moves on to another topic after that. So what he says on the front end is whoa, that's a lot to take in. Well, in Matthew chapter 19, and we're going to go there because he talks about it a little bit further, but he's still kind of, again, it's pretty harsh in terms of how he addresses this. And he says in Matthew chapter 19, in verse 3, he says, some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question. So here's what the Pharisees, who were the religious teachers of that time, they would try and trap Jesus all the time. They would ask him these questions that they wanted to prove he wasn't who he says that he was. Okay, and so they would ask him these questions, and they'd be like, all right, if we can get Jesus to say it this way, then it'll show that he's actually not from God. All right, so in this case, they were trying to trap him and trying to pin him against Moses. And so in verse 3, it says, should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Okay, so this is this thought. There are some acceptable reasons for divorce, but just for any reason, Jesus? He says, haven't you read the scriptures? So remember that part. That's going to be really important as we continue this. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? They record from the beginning that God made them male and female. And he said this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one, right? So the two united into one is a big deal. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. In our context, and on this sermon, we could say, let no one try and find a loophole for what God has joined together. Then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? They're trying to get him there. And Jesus says, well, Moses permitted divorce as a concession to your what? Hard heart. Which means the hard heart idea is the thought that like you're not interested in what God wants. You're not interested in what God desires for you. And because of your hard hearts, like that's the response to it. So Moses did something there as a concession. He says, but it was not what God had originally intended. So he's pointing back again to, haven't you heard what was originally intended? So this concession, you got to think about it this way. This concession that Moses did, because men were not treating marriage like they should be, the concession was, hey, you can get divorced, you can just send a certificate. And that concession was actually to protect women. Because if they had been just they were treated as commodities and everything like that. And so if the women were just cast out, Moses is like, well, that can't happen. And you men aren't treating this right. So as a concession because of your hard heart, as a concession because of your sinful actions, as a concession, then, okay, here, you guys can do this. And then the men at that point took it and ran with it, rather than looking for what was ideal. He says, I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife, and the same thing he says again, and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. And so then the disciples, look at this, the disciples say, well, Jesus, if this is the case, it is better not to marry. Now you would think at this point Jesus would say, my bad. I realized that was like a little harsh. I shouldn't have come that aggressive on them like that, like, man, those Pharisees, they really get me going. They frustrate me. I want to post stuff all the time that I don't really mean. And it just kind of feeling that a little bit. But look what Jesus says. Well, not everyone can accept this statement. Only those whom God helps. Meaning the only people that will actually hear this are the ones that are tied into God in this moment and what this really means. And he says, some are born as eunuchs. Some have been made eunuchs by others. Some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. So you can imagine how tough it was for people to hear. You can imagine what was going on. See, their culture back then about marriage and divorce and sex and dating, well, there's no such thing as dating back then, but relationally, what was going on is not terribly different than how we treat it now. And so I think there's just one main thought for today, and that's this: we need to stop looking for loopholes. We need to stop looking for loopholes. And I want to base everything off of this. Because if we can stop looking for loopholes, then we'll be responsible with what's given before us. If we can stop looking for loopholes, we'll strive for excellence in all that we have. And so what Jesus is kind of pushing on them is actually not really about divorce, though it is a little bit. What he's trying to get them to is way before that. Way before that. You know, right now I hear people say all the time, we've got such a problem about marriage in our culture. You know, over half of marriages are ending in divorce, and which that isn't even technically true. You guys have heard me talk about this before. 76% of people that have gotten married are still in their first marriages, okay? It's just the folks that get divorced, a lot of times there's multiple divorces, so the numbers keep going up, all right? So that number's not necessarily true, but here's people say, marriage is such a problem in our culture, and here's my response. Marriage is a problem in our culture because Christians have not taken what Jesus taught serious enough. So when someone says, there's a war on marriage in our culture, I'm like, no, there's not. So Christians just don't take marriage serious enough. We don't think about it enough before we get married. We don't do the things before we get married to constitute and have a great, healthy marriage. We don't do the things while we're in marriage to have continued healthy marriage. And that's only based off of what Jesus taught. So I think the issue, or the problem culturally, actually has more to do with us looking for loopholes, with us not really thinking about what Jesus taught. When you think about in that Matthew 19 passage, the disciples respond, well, then who in the world would want to get married? If marriage is this serious, who would want to do it? And Jesus says, exactly. Who would want to do it? See, what Jesus is doing it's actually pretty fascinating. He's getting people off of this idea of divorce, because they're trying to find the loophole of how do I get out of this? And he's pulling them back into this larger picture of how we should look at marriage and how we should look at love and how we should look at our own life and our own purpose and our own identity. It's actually just so brilliant what he does. Now, it seems harsh, and there is an element that it feels harsh and it feels difficult. But he brings it back, and he's just like, stop looking for loopholes. And in verse 4 of that Matthew 19 passage, he said, haven't you read the scriptures? And here's what he means. See, to those Pharisees at the time, they're supposed to be well-versed in religious law and everything else. And he's like, do you even know and believe what you actually have read and what you're actually teaching? He goes, all of this stuff has been settled already. And he brings them back all the way to the beginning. Why would he bring them all the way back to creation? Why would he do that? And it doesn't matter if you think a literal creation, if you think, if you believe in a literal Adam and Eve, or if you don't, the message is still the same about creation. And the message, even what Jesus is teaching, is still the same, so it doesn't even matter. But Jesus brings them all the way back to creation. He goes, there was an ideal. And here's the ideal, that these two people getting married, that there's this divine thing that happens in marriage. It's a divine thing. So you got to take that part seriously. So there's this ideal. And then the listeners would have been like, yeah, but Jesus, what about? And he'd be like, stop looking for loopholes. Go back to what was ideal. And look at this. This is divine thing in marriage of two people coming together. He goes, but what you guys have done is you've started to get selfish about it. What you guys have done is start saying, I can get married and it's fine, and I can do this and I can do that. What you guys have done is you've really messed up the message. And here's what happened. Men, here's what you've done, men. You started treating women like commodities. You started viewing them just through sexual pleasure. You started having them as you could just exchange them in for a better version. You started doing all these things, and you've demeaned women, and you've done all this stuff, and they would be like, well, Jesus, what about the head of the home? And what about Jesus? What about, we're ahead of our wives, and Jesus, what about? And he would look at them, and he would say, where are you getting that from? And they would say, well, do you remember in the creation story, afterwards when sin came into this world? And the end result was this ordering of people, and Jesus would say, well, why are you looking at sin and not what I'd actually desire for you? Is sin what is driving your perspective on marriage? Is sin what is driving your perspective on men and women? Is sin what is driving your perspective on sex? Or are you looking at maybe how I had this, what it's meant to be? And they would have been like, well, Jesus, but he'd be like, stop looking for loopholes. See, if you want to talk about creation, well, at creation, men and women were equal. At creation, they would say, well, yeah, but Jesus, it says it in there, the word that they say, the woman is the man's helper. And Jesus would say, do you know where else that word was used for? God. So the only other time the word helper was used in the entire scripture that you're reading through was to describe God. It was not an inferiority thing. But men, you've made it one. Well, why is that? Because you've taken what's supposed to be divine and you've let men or humans speak into it and tried to separate what God had tried to what? Bring together. And so Jesus is like, why would you do that? Yeah, but Jesus, that's hard. And he'd be like, I know. Exactly. That's the point. Yeah, but Jesus, you don't know what she's like. You don't know what he's like. And he would say, I do. I created them. But he's trying to get them to understand something far deeper and something far more serious. He's trying to get them to understand how important our relationships are, first. Second, that if everyone would just view marriage this way, here's what would start to happen. If you viewed marriage as this kind of like divine thing that happens, okay? Here's what you would do. You would approach marriage very differently. As a single person, this is where it should start. If you're single, you have a plan in place. A plan what it looks like to stay healthy. A plan what it looks like to have a good kind of view on love. A plan to look like and boundaries in place to make sure you aren't misstepping or going too far with something. Then when you're engaged, you have a plan in place to make sure you have the right boundaries, the right kind of cultivating the right things and going about it that way. I skipped a step there. Then when you start dating someone, you have a plan in place. And then when you get engaged, same thing. And then when you get married, same thing. Then when you do that, here's what ends up happening. Marriage starts getting put in its proper context. You see what Jesus is also saying here when he was like, yeah, exactly my point. When the disciples were like, who would want to do this? He's like, not everyone can hear this message. Jesus' point is this, that marriage is not the be-all, end-all to your whole purpose in life. Sex is not the be-all, end-all to your whole purpose in life and your whole identity, so stop trying to do it. Stop trying to make it that. That's where we get in trouble with all this stuff. Jesus also says this, and this is why it's so incredible when we look at what he's actually pointing to, when he brings it back to the two becoming one. Here's what Jesus says, that the result of marriage is oneness. Yeah, but Wags, I know. That's what we're trying to get to. Two becoming one. That's what we're working on. And no, Jesus says the result of marriage is oneness. No, but Wags, we got our goals. We're going to get there, Wags. I'm like, no. Jesus says the result of marriage is oneness. It's not what you're trying to get to. He says, you're one. This is why divorce can be so painful. This is why the impact can linger. This is why it can bleed over into other relationships. Why? Because things have been broken that should have been made one. Things have been tried to get broken, and Jesus says this. This is what's so crazy about what Jesus is saying. He says it this way. He is responding to people trying to find a loophole, and they're like, okay, I get it. The result of marriage is one. Okay, Jesus, but how do I undo that? And Jesus' response is he can't. And just like right now, you could hear a pin drop. Because this is how serious Jesus is saying we need to take it. He's like, you can't. You can't undo it. Well, what about when this is a justified divorce, and what about when I get remarried? And he would say this. I know, I'm not saying you can't do those things. You can't get remarried. I'm not saying that, but you got to understand that, what happened before. So am I supposed to divorce? Should I just divorce the person I'm married to now? And he's like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. He's just saying we got to start over here. We've got to rethink here. We've got to have a whole new round of grace for all of this here. See, what Jesus is actually pointing us towards is saying, stop trying to find loopholes in all of this. Stop trying to find a way around this. And so I think if Jesus were around today, I think he would sit us down. If you went to him for counseling and you're single, you'd be like, Jesus, I really want to get married. And he would say, why? Well, because that's how I feel complete. And that's what he'd be like, nope. He would say, no, you can find that in me. And here's his point. That when we elevate him and we take this part seriously, then you know what becomes a viable option to live in this world? Being single. You know what can become fulfilling? Being single. Being celibate. Those are viable options. But the second we make sex and marriage an idol, those options go away. And Christians are the worst at this. Think about it. You're single in church, what happens? How old are you? Oh, I'm 29. Oh. You haven't? Have you met her? She'll be great. You guys should be great together. Meet someone else. How old are you? I'm 34. Oh, can I pray for you? What happens? It becomes an idol. So then someone who's single is like, well, I guess I need that because you keep telling me I'm inferior. You keep telling me I'm not worth it. You keep telling me I can never be fulfilled. And you present sex in this way that if I can't have that either, then what in the world can I ever do? And Jesus is like, no. That's not what this is about. So if you're single, he would present this whole different message. He would say, hey, listen, stop trying to find loopholes with who you're dating. But Jesus, he's got a cross on his back. He says, stop trying to find loopholes. We're engaged and we're having sex. We're just trying to feel like we're compatible. Jesus would say, you're sexually compatible with millions of people in this world. It's not about sex. So it's not about that. He's trying to get us to understand this on a deeper level of how serious this is. And if we would take it seriously while we're dating, if we would take it seriously while we're engaged, if we would take it seriously when we're single, and it starts reshaping how we view love and marriage and sex and our purpose and our identity. And then he says this to you married folks. Why are you not taking it seriously now? You think you accomplished something because you got married? If you don't have a plan how to grow your marriage now, I promise you, you will someday sit in front of me if you are still here and be like, I don't know why we don't love each other anymore. The kids are out of the house and we feel like we're just living parallel lives. Man, the first 3 years were great, but I don't know where we are right now. I don't think I love her anymore like I used to. Or, gosh, I didn't realize he was that annoying. Do you know why that happens? Is because married people don't accept the responsibility of what it takes to have a healthy marriage, and then their marriages lack excellence. If you are married in this place today, if you don't have a plan on how to grow your marriage every single year and look at that plan and talk about that plan, communicate about that plan, continue to grow that plan and everything else, you are heading down a bad road. And we do that when we're looking for loopholes, because here's what we'll do. Oh gosh, I got kids. It's just gotten so tough. Work is so busy. Loophole, 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 loophole. So is Jesus talking about divorce? Kind of. What he's really talking about is, what do you really think about love and marriage beforehand? Can you imagine if every single person in here, when they were single, had a plan? Can you imagine if every single person dating had a plan to protect, a plan to take it seriously? Can you imagine if every single marriage had a plan to protect and to grow? There'd be no divorce. That's Jesus' point. We wouldn't even be talking about it. Now, I want to say this, because I also realize that folks in here have been divorced. And so, after sitting down with so many people over the years that have stepped into divorce or heading towards divorce or whatever, one of the common things that I sit with people for, and it breaks my heart every time. It breaks my heart every time. And it's usually just one out of the two. I've never met both that have been in the scenario. It's usually just one. There'll be so much guilt and shame. And today was not about that. Today is really about the fact that I want you to know that Jesus never judged anyone who got divorced. He never condemned anyone who got divorced. What did he do? He went like this. Come on. Bring it in here. And he loved on people. He showed grace to everyone. I think now, even in this moment, if he were here, he would look at you and he would just say, listen, man, when I died on that cross and when I resurrected again, that overcoming piece, that idea that the pain that was there that we're supposed to kind of resonate with, that was for you in this moment. To hear that, to know that, to experience it, that we all need grace. We all need love. We all need, all of us. And he would say, I want you to just, that was for you. And I think he would talk to all of us and he would say, you know what, guys? There are people that are hurting. There are people that feel like they've messed things up. There are people that might feel guilty or feel shame and it's overwhelming them. But you know what? We are all in this together. We encourage each other. We elevate each other. We pick each other. We empower each other. And we do that because of God's good grace. It's supposed to be for everyone. So if that's your story and you feel, I would just say this to you. There is hope. There is love. And that God's got something so beautiful for you in the future. I don't know what that is, but I know, I believe, and I trust in God that it's going to be beautiful if we choose to. But the only way we can experience God's grace, and I want this to be our last thought, is to acknowledge that we need it. Not just someone who's divorced, we all, all of us. All of us. We need it. Let's pray. God, this morning, in this room, there are single people. There are folks that are dating. There are folks that are engaged. There are folks that are married. There are folks that are divorced. The message for all of us is still the same. The message is that you love us. The message is you want to give us grace. The message is that when we're connected to you, it's where we discover who we were truly meant to be. It's where we find our greatest purpose. It's where we find our greatest hope. It's where we find our greatest freedom. It's where we find our greatest perspective on any stage of life that we are in. And a yes to you in the midst of this, God, means that we can find a plan of what this looks like to grow, to have some tangible things to do this, no matter what phase we're in. To have people around us to speak life and truth into us. To experience you on a different level. And God, my hope is that we would want to choose to do that. That we wouldn't hold on to guilt or to shame or to any of those things, but that we would want to experience life in a way that we never have before. Because we say yes to you and believe and trust in you, that living how you would desire for us is the best way to do it. And so, God, I pray just for open hearts for all of us and a sense of conviction for all of us. Whatever phase we are in, that we'd want to have a plan, that we'd stop looking for loopholes, and that we would believe that what you have for us is truly best. In your name we pray, everybody said. Amen, amen. Hey, three quick things, I promise. One, if you want prayer with anybody, we've got folks over here to my right that are available to pray with you wherever you're going through. And then if you want to connect with people in the What's Next Lounge too, they can do that and help you with next steps to get connected here. Influencers Weekend. We got 2 weeks till this is happening. Influencers Weekend is February 22nd, 23rd. If you guys don't know what it is a weekend about being good at life. Okay, and so we want to help people be better at life. We've got Friday night is like a worship night, and I'll be speaking that night. It's a lot of practical teaching about just being better at life. And then we've got 8 other speakers on Saturday from 9 to 2. We've got like a former NFL player. We've got someone who's on TV here locally. We've got some business owners. We've got another pastor. We've got, there's a whole like wide range of folks talking about a wide range of things to just be better at life. And I would say high school and up. It'll be great. And so I would love to have you be a part of that. And we've got folks in the lounge on your right that are waiting and ready for you. If you want to sign up for that on your way out today to help you to do that, we'd love to do that. And the last thing is this. I just want to say thank you guys so much for your continued generosity in this place. Every time I get a good email, I just delete the bad ones. So if you send me, no, I'm just kidding. Anytime I get a good email, I am so deeply impacted by what's transpiring in people's lives. And I can never get over it. I can never get over it. And to hear things that people are going through and how God is just doing something in them, I think about it all the time. I'm like, my gosh, like when we are so generous towards wanting to create environments, generous towards wanting to get people, all that stuff, God shows up in these miraculous ways that we never would have thought of. And so I just want to thank you guys so much for your generosity to help continue to cultivate that. Some things are just hearing from folks that I was talking with someone this week just about as they're fostering a teenager right now and hearing part of that story. And I was just like, gosh, it's so cool to be connected to that. And it's because of your generosity that we're able to. And it's some really neat things happening there. And so I'm just so thankful for that. If you do want to give, there's share boxes on your way out. And you can do it online, and directions are in your seat. But thank you so much for being a part of it. Have a great rest of your Sunday. We'll see you next week.